Immunology, or the study of our body's defense system, dates back to the 18th century with Edward Jenner's pioneering work on smallpox vaccination. Over the following centuries, the field steadily evolved, with monumental contribution from Louis Pasteur, who advanced the germ theory, and Ilya Mechnikov, who discovered phagocytes and promoted cellular immunity. By the mid-20th century, immunology had transformed into a robust scientific discipline, encompassing not only the body's response to pathogens, but also its intricate mechanisms for distinguishing self from non-self. Then, the 1970s were a decade of profound transitions in medicine. Advances in immunology and genetics were breaking new ground, yet treatments for many immunologic diseases remained elusive. Organ transplantation had recently moved from science fiction to reality, but the rejection rates were still high. Moreover, the concept of the human genome was emerging, but practical applications, like gene therapy, were still a pipe dream at that time. In the middle of this evolving medical landscape, a young boy with a rare genetic disorder became a symbol of both the promises and limitations of medicine. His life in isolation highlighted the complexities of immune system disorders, and his death drove forward research that has since transformed medicine. So today, let's explore the story of David Vetter, a boy who spent his entire life in isolation, and how his short but extraordinary journey significantly contributed to our modern understanding of immunology and medicine. Chapter 1. The Beginning. The year was 1971. In Houston, Texas, a baby boy named David Vetter was born with a rare genetic disorder requiring extreme isolation. His doctors at Texas Children's Hospital were preparing tirelessly for his birth. They meticulously scrubbed every surface, sterilized every instrument, and coordinated every single step. This was no ordinary delivery. This was a race against time for a newborn baby boy named David Vetter, who could die if not brought to a sterile environment immediately after delivery. David's parents knew their baby was different. Carol and David Vetter Sr. had already lost one child to a disease called Severe Combined Immunodeficiency, or SCID, pronouncing SCID. Diseases like SCID that are due to a defective gene on the X chromosome are passed to boys only from their carrier mothers, who have a good and a bad copy of the gene on their X chromosomes. Males with the mutant gene on the X chromosome normally die of the infectious disease before their reproductive age, so they cannot pass down the defective gene to their daughter. The Vetters were told that if they had a boy, there was a 50% chance that he would inherit the defective gene. If their next son were unlucky and drew the defective chromosome, he could suffer the same fate as his brother. It was a heart-wrenching decision, but they chose to have another child. Happily, their wish for a son was granted, but sadly, he did not inherit his mother's healthy genes. Fortunately, they had Dr. Raphael Wilson on their team, an expert in germ-free environments, who could build and maintain the sterile isolation chamber to protect their soon-to-be-born son. Dr. Wilson had previously achieved remarkable results in Germany with a sterile isolator for twins born with immunodeficiency. After spending a short amount of time in the bubble, the twins' immune systems inexplicably activated, allowing them to leave the isolating chamber. This gave the Vetters doctors reason for optimism. Moreover, because of their religious beliefs and their desire for more children, they decided to continue with the pregnancy. So everyone prepared extensively for the arrival of a special newborn baby. On September 21st, 1971, David Vetter Jr. was born, and within seconds was placed into a sterile chamber. But, to truly understand David's story, let's first talk about the disease that forced him to live in isolation. Severe Combined Immunodeficiency, or SCID, is a rare genetic disorder that results in a defective immune system. Normally, when our bodies are infected, our immune system goes to war against the invading pathogens, with specialized immune cells acting as soldiers to fight off the enemy. This defense system is crucial for protecting us against harmful agents. However, in the case of SCID, these immune fighters are either not produced or too weak, leaving the body vulnerable to infection. SCID is the most severe form of primary immunodeficiencies, with at least 9 mutations linked to the disease. In David's case, he had X-linked SCID caused by a mutation in the gene IL-2RG, which encodes for the common gamma chain. This protein is critical for the development and differentiation of T and B cells, which are essential components of the immune system. Mutations that affect the common gamma chain can lead to a complete failure of the immune system to develop and function, resulting in low or non-functional T cells, B cells, and NK cells. Since the IL-2RG gene is located on the X chromosome, a carrier mother has 50% chance of passing the defective copy to her children. Tragically, in the Vetter's case, David inherited the mutated gene and developed SCID. Chapter 2. David's birth and childhood. David's life was anything but ordinary from the moment he was born. To prepare for his delivery, David's medical team thoroughly scrubbed the delivery room, leaving no corner or cabinet untouched. Any pathogen in the environment could have proved deadly to David, whose body was unable to fight off infections like a healthy person. The medical team practiced repeatedly to minimize his exposure to the outside environment, moving as quickly as possible. A sterile chamber was prepared in advance, anticipating the possibility that he would have a non-functional gene. The plan at that time was to immediately place him in isolation, test him, and if his immune system proved functional, remove him from the chamber. However, if he was confirmed to have SCID, he would need to remain in isolation while exploring other treatment options. Following his delivery by C-section, David was immediately placed into isolation, and thanks to the team's careful preparation, he was only exposed to the outside environment for a few seconds. Blood work unfortunately confirmed that he indeed had SCID. David's unusual birth was followed by an equally unique upbringing. All of his food had to be sterilized, meaning he could only consume jarred or canned items. The labels were removed from cans to avoid any chance of contamination. Ice cream, with its high-fat content, was off-limits because it couldn't be sterilized. Another treat David longed to try was Coca-Cola. David had heard about Coca-Cola so often on TV and from other children that he always wanted to try one. Unfortunately, his medical team found it impossible to sterilize Coca-Cola without the heat breaking down the carbonation and ruining the flavor. For the first 3 years of his life, David lived in a sterile bubble at Texas Children's Hospital. However, when he turned 3, a similar chamber was installed at his parents' house in Conroe, Texas, allowing him to shuttle between the hospital and home. Alongside the bubble, a constant in David's life was the low hum of the motors that kept it inflated with filtered air. Despite his confinement, David's life was not entirely tied to the chamber. When he was 6, NASA constructed a special spacesuit that allowed him to leave the chamber and walk around, though it still needed to stay connected to the bubble via a long tube. He used the suit about 7 times, then apparently lost interest. However, the reality is that he had been living in isolation for years, and undoubtedly this would have a long-lasting effect on him. Living in isolation poses significant mental challenges for anyone, but being born into it has an even more significant impact on the development of a child. Chapter 3. The challenges of living in isolation. First of all, language came slowly for David. As an infant, he did not babble consistently and also did not engage with others through voice, gestures, or play. To support him, a speech pathologist was brought in. At 13 months old, she noted his limited abilities and wrote this, quote, "He did not seem to understand his name or the word no, did not look at objects or people when they were named, and did not follow simple commands. His oral language expression was virtually non-existent, and he did not use gestures to communicate." Unquote. This delay was thought to be due to the many people David encountered daily with inconsistent language interactions. However, by age 2, David was communicating appropriately for his age, though his vocabulary was distinctly different from most 2-year-olds and included a lot of medical terms. By 3, David was assessed to be developmentally 2 years ahead of his peers, with an IQ measured at 126. In terms of formal teaching, David began with a tutor twice a week at his home. By the 2nd grade, a speakerphone had been connected with a classroom at school, and David was able to participate in discussions and even compete in the spelling bees. Although David was a straight A student, he showed no effort in his work. The greatest difficulty in David's cognitive development was his visual perception. Having spent all of his life in enclosed spaces looking out windows, he did not fully develop 3-dimensional perception. He did not understand that buildings in the distance were larger than they appeared. At the same time, he also did not believe that buildings had backsides he could not see. It was only at the age of 6 that he agreed the medical clinic seen from his hospital window did have 4 sides. Despite living in isolation, David was fortunate to have a loving family and caring friends. His parents worked tirelessly to ensure that he had a happy childhood. They even invited David's schoolmates and neighbors' children into their home to play. David's best friend and neighbor, Sean, went to great lengths to arrange for a local theater to screen Return of the Jedi, so that David could experience a normal childhood activity, although he still had to watch from within his transport bubble. David's case attracted a great deal of attention from the public and the media. Throughout, he was a national curiosity. His movements were chronicled from time to time on television. In a sense, he had become the star of a mini version of The Truman Show. Regardless, his parents did their best to protect his privacy and shield him from prying eyes, to provide him with a normal childhood. David and his sister Catherine had a close relationship, and she doted on him. For the first 9 years of his life, whenever he was home, she chose to sleep right next to his bubble to keep him company. Yet, as the years passed, the psychological toll of his isolation became increasingly evident. As a result, his doctors soon faced a very crucial decision: whether they should let David leave the sterile chamber that had both protected and confined him for years. Chapter 4. The Loneliness Within. For David, his whole world was a bubble made of plastic and steel. It was a world without hugs, without the feel of rain on his skin, without the simple joys of a normal childhood. Everything he touched, every breath he took, had to be filtered and sterilized. His bubble was more than just a room, it was his universe. David's parents were determined to give him a normal life as much as possible. They talked to him, read to him, played with him through the walls of his bubble. They brought him toys and books, anything to stimulate his mind and nourish his spirit. Despite their efforts, the long-term effects of David's isolation were detrimental to his mental health. He could see the world outside, but could never truly be a part of it. His childhood was a constant reminder of what he was missing, of the life he could not have. While other children were able to attend school, make friends, and enjoy a typical childhood, David was deprived of these experiences. That was extremely difficult for David, as in the 1970s, there was no internet or cell phones. The isolation, without any means to connect with the outside world, was extremely hard for David. The isolation grew even harder as he grew older. His sister and his friends began to have less time to spend with him. His mother noticed that, quote, David seemed to be growing more pensive. It showed in his expressive eyes. He became more private and would no longer share his thoughts with anyone, unquote. At the same time, he also shared with his psychologist Mary Murphy, quote, whatever I do depends on what somebody else decides I do. Why school? Why did you make me learn to read? What good will it do? I won't ever be able to do anything anyway, unquote. She noted that he was becoming more introverted and melancholic. Another doctor reached a similar conclusion around 1980, as a psychiatric report showed that David was becoming increasingly unhappy and might even contemplate leaving the bubble on his own. A meeting was convened to discuss David's mental state and explore the possibility of allowing him to venture outside, followed by administering antibiotics medication if he contracted an infection. However, this option posed a significant risk as David's immune system was extremely vulnerable, and any delay in responding to infection could prove fatal. Moreover, repeated infections without the help of the functional immune system would eventually lead to severe complications. As a result, the medical team decided to hold off on taking any drastic measures. Nonetheless, the question remained, is there light at the end of the tunnel, or will he have to stay isolated for a longer period of time? Chapter 5. The Bittersweet Ending. For David and other children with similar conditions, a bone marrow transplant was the best treatment option. When he was born and was confirmed to have SCID, it was his only treatment option. A bone marrow transplant is like giving someone a new immune system. If successful, it could allow David to leave his bubble and experience the world without fear. Unfortunately, his sister, who was the most likely compatible donor, was not a match. The medical community was invested in David's case, but years passed, and they still couldn't find a matching donor. By 1983, research in bone marrow transplants had advanced to the point where donors did not have to be exact matches to recipients. This news gave immense hope to David's family. After discussing with the entire family, David's sister decided to give her bone marrow to him. Her bone marrow was extracted, treated, and given to David. 4 months after receiving the transplant, David was finally removed from his isolation chamber. Not because he was cured, but because he was dying from lymphoma. While David's body did not reject the transplant, he became infected with infectious mononucleosis after a few months. It was later learned that his sister had passed the Epstein-Barr virus on to him, which overwhelmed his body. The infection later led to Burkitt lymphoma, a connection that was previously suspected in medical literature. The Epstein-Barr virus, dormant in Catherine and harmless to most, had been unknowingly transmitted to David during the transplant. At that time, pre-transplant screening could not screen for Epstein-Barr virus, and this complication was only learned during autopsy. After the transplant, it soon became apparent that he would not make it, and he was fading fast. It was devastating for everybody, but there was a bittersweet ending in David's final days. With the obvious clinical outcome, there was no clear benefit in keeping him in a sterile environment anymore. He wouldn't make it regardless. So after 12 years, he was finally freed from his isolation bubble, got to hug his parents and touch his surroundings. He even got to kiss his mother for the first time. He soon became weaker and weaker, and finally, he told everyone, "I love you all." He then winked at his doctor, smiled at his family, went to sleep, and never woke up again. However, David's story did not end with his passing, and unbeknownst to him, he unknowingly left behind a long-lasting impact on science and medicine. Chapter 6. David's Legacy. David Vetter's story is one of extraordinary circumstances of a life lived within the confines of a plastic bubble. He faced challenges most of us can barely comprehend. Though his life was cut short, David's legacy lives on. While most of us find inspiration in the emotional and complex circumstances of David's life, scientists and doctors found a drive to develop better treatment for children without a robust immune system. As a result, David left behind a lasting impact on the fields of immunology, genetics, and medical ethics. Firstly, David's unique circumstances provided an unprecedented opportunity for us to understand the Epstein-Barr virus, which is also known as EBV. Because his environment was so controlled, David's doctors were able to link the cancerous lymphoma that killed him to the Epstein-Barr virus that was present in Catherine's donated bone marrow. At the time, the Epstein-Barr virus was suspected of contributing to cancer in immunocompromised patients, such as those undergoing heart transplants. David's case provided definitive evidence of the link, contributing to our understanding of how this innocuous virus behaves in a host with a weakened immune system. Secondly, beyond the technical and scientific advances, David's life ignited critical ethical discussions in medicine. His case raised questions about the balance between prolonging life and ensuring quality of life. The decision to place him in a sterile environment from birth while offering a chance for survival also isolated him from the touch of his parents and the freedom of childhood. His story challenged the medical community to consider not only the physical health, but also the psychological and social dimensions of care. Most importantly, David's case provided critical insights into the genetic basis of X-linked SCID. At the time of his birth, SCID was a poorly understood condition with few options for treatment beyond the experimental. Research into David's condition laid the groundwork for significant advances, including the discovery of the genetic of SCID. Cell lines derived from David contributed to the groundbreaking work of Masayuki Noguchi in 1993, who identified mutations in the interleukin-2 receptor gene on the X chromosome as a cause of X-linked SCID. He used 3 preserved samples from male children with X-linked SCID to look at what caused the disorder. Dr. Noguchi found that in all 3 samples, one of them being Vetter's, there was a mutation in the IL-2 receptor gene. This receptor is essential for the growth and maintenance of lymphocytes, so patients with X-linked SCID usually has a small amount of T cells, non-functional B cells, and a low amount of NK cells, making them defenseless against infections. As a result, we now know that mutations of the IL-2 RG gene, or interleukin-2 receptor subunit gamma gene, can lead to SCID. Also thanks to Noguchi's findings, doctors now could conduct prenatal genetic screenings for IL-2 mutations to see if a female carried the mutation and could potentially pass it on to her offspring. Moreover, David's legacy extends to the development of gene therapy. By the 1990s, researchers devised methods to deliver functioning genes to human cells. With Noguchi's work on the discovery of IL-2 mutations in SCID, doctors could theoretically provide a functional copy of the IL-2 gene for children with SCID, and they did exactly that. In 1999, doctors successfully inserted the IL-2RG gene into the bone marrow cells of children with SCID. By 2002, it was clear that most of these children were cured and were enjoying what David longed for, a life outside the bubble. David's life was encapsulated perfectly by his epitaph. He never touched the world, but the world was touched by him.